In this episode, we start by making monitoring and metrics feel like a practical management tool instead of a surveillance activity or a pile of numbers, because beginners often hear metrics and immediately think of dashboards that look impressive but do not change anything. In privacy engineering, monitoring and metrics exist for one purpose: to prove controls are operating, to detect drift before it becomes harm, and to give leaders information they can use to prioritize improvements and allocate resources. The CDPSE exam expects you to understand that a privacy program is not finished when policies are written or when assessments are completed, because programs decay unless they are monitored. Data flows change, teams change, vendors change, and even well-designed controls can quietly stop working if no one checks them. Monitoring is the activity of observing and reviewing whether processes and controls function, while metrics are the measurements that summarize that observation in a way that supports decisions. Leaders can only act on metrics if the metrics are clear, relevant to risk and obligations, and tied to ownership and remediation pathways. By the end, you should be able to explain what monitoring is, what makes a metric actionable, how to build a monitoring routine that stays consistent, and how to avoid common traps like counting easy numbers that do not reflect privacy outcomes. A strong foundation is understanding what privacy program monitoring is actually monitoring, because privacy programs span governance, risk assessment, data lifecycle control, vendor oversight, incident response, and rights fulfillment. Monitoring is not just watching for cyber attacks, and it is not only checking compliance once a year. It is verifying that privacy controls operate as designed across these program elements. For example, monitoring can include checking whether privacy assessments are completed before launch, whether recommended controls are implemented, and whether residual risk approvals are documented. It can include checking whether data inventories remain current after system changes, whether retention schedules are enforced, and whether access reviews occur on schedule. It can include checking whether vendors continue to meet obligations and whether subprocessor changes are disclosed and reviewed. It can include checking whether incident response processes are activated appropriately and whether remediation actions are completed. It can also include checking whether rights requests are handled within defined timelines and whether exception handling is consistent. The exam expects you to recognize that monitoring is a governance capability because it links policy to reality, turning standards into measurable behavior. Beginners sometimes assume monitoring is only for mature organizations, but monitoring is essential for new programs too, because it reveals where processes are weak and where training is missing. When you see monitoring as verification across the full program, you can design metrics that reflect real privacy outcomes rather than narrow technical signals. Actionable metrics begin with clear questions that leaders need to answer, because metrics without a decision purpose become noise. Leaders typically need to know whether the organization is meeting obligations, whether risk is trending up or down, where the biggest gaps are, and where resources will reduce risk most effectively. Metrics should therefore be tied to program objectives, such as maintaining rights handling performance, reducing incident impact, improving vendor oversight, and keeping data inventories accurate. The exam often tests whether you can distinguish between vanity metrics and actionable metrics, and the difference is whether a metric leads to a clear next step. For example, knowing that training completion is 98% may sound good, but it does not prove people can handle rights requests correctly, while a metric showing repeated disclosure errors in support tickets points directly to process and training improvements. Another example is counting the number of policies, which does not show operational effectiveness, versus measuring whether required privacy reviews occur before changes, which indicates whether governance is functioning. Actionable metrics also require definitions that are stable, so the organization measures the same thing consistently over time, enabling trends rather than one-off snapshots. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking the more metrics the better, when too many metrics dilute attention and reduce action. When you focus on a small set of high-value questions, you can select metrics that help leaders act. A practical way to build an actionable metric set is to align metrics to the major operational capabilities that drive privacy outcomes, because those capabilities are what leaders can influence. Rights request handling is one capability, where metrics can capture intake volume, time to acknowledge, time to verify identity, time to fulfill, and error or rework rates. Incident management is another capability where metrics can capture time to detect, time to triage, time to contain, and completion of remediation actions, all of which reflect operational readiness and improvement. Vendor oversight is another capability where metrics can capture completion of due diligence for new vendors, timeliness of vendor review renewals, and whether vendor incidents and subprocessor changes are handled within defined expectations. Assessment and design governance is another capability where metrics can capture whether privacy assessments occur before launch and whether assessment-recommended controls are implemented. Data lifecycle control is another capability where metrics can reflect inventory completeness, retention compliance, and reduction of unnecessary data spread into logs or analytics. Training and awareness is another capability where metrics can capture role-based completion, comprehension indicators, and correlations with reduced errors in operations. The exam expects you to understand that metrics should map to these capabilities because capabilities are where leaders can fund improvements, enforce policy, and assign accountability. When metrics align to capabilities, they naturally suggest action paths. Monitoring routines are what make metrics reliable because metrics are only as good as the data and processes that produce them. A monitoring routine defines what is reviewed, how often it is reviewed, who reviews it, and what happens when issues are found. The exam expects you to think about monitoring as repeatable, meaning it is built into program governance rather than performed only when a problem occurs. For example, a routine might include monthly review of rights request performance, quarterly review of vendor oversight status, periodic access review checks, and scheduled updates of processing records and inventories. Monitoring should also include triggers for off-cycle review, such as incidents, major system changes, or expansion into new regions, because those events can change risk quickly. Another key part is that monitoring must have outputs, such as findings, remediation tasks, and follow-up verification, because monitoring without follow-through is just observation. Beginners sometimes imagine monitoring as passive data collection, but mature monitoring is an active feedback loop that detects drift and drives improvement. Monitoring also requires clear ownership and escalation paths, because leaders need to know who is responsible for fixing what. When routines are defined and followed, metrics become dependable signals rather than noisy guesses. Metrics must also be interpreted carefully, because privacy outcomes are influenced by context, and leaders can be misled if metrics are taken at face value without understanding what they represent. For example, an increase in rights request volume might reflect greater user awareness, a new transparency notice, or a major incident, and interpreting it as a sign of program failure could lead to the wrong response. Similarly, a decrease in incident count might reflect underreporting rather than improvement, especially if training and reporting culture are weak. The exam may test whether you understand that metrics can be gamed, intentionally or unintentionally, and that strong programs design metrics to reduce gaming by focusing on outcomes and by combining measures. For instance, pairing training completion with operational error rates can reveal whether training is effective, while pairing incident count with time to detect can reveal whether detection is improving. Another important concept is leading versus lagging indicators, where lagging indicators like incidents show what already happened, while leading indicators like completion of assessments, access reviews, and vendor monitoring can predict risk before harm occurs. Leaders can act more effectively when they have leading indicators that reveal drift early. Beginners often focus only on incidents because they are visible, but a mature metric set includes both prevention and response indicators. When you interpret metrics with context and with a mix of indicator types, you avoid false confidence and you focus on real risk reduction. A central requirement for actionable metrics is clear definitions, because without definitions, different teams report different numbers and leaders cannot compare results or see trends. Definitions include what counts as a rights request when the clock starts, what counts as fulfillment, and what counts as an exception. For incident metrics, definitions include what counts as a privacy incident, what counts as discovery time, and what counts as containment. For vendor metrics, definitions include what counts as due diligence completion, what counts as a vendor review cycle, and what counts as compliance with subprocessor disclosure obligations. The exam expects you to recognize that definitions should be documented as part of program governance, because definitions create measurement consistency and prevent disputes. Another key point is data quality for metrics, because metrics built on incomplete or inconsistent records can mislead leaders and cause poor decisions. This is why evidence and artifacts matter, because monitoring relies on records like request logs, incident records, assessment reports, and vendor review documentation. Beginners sometimes think metrics are separate from documentation, but metrics are derived from documentation, and weak documentation produces weak metrics. Strong programs design workflows that capture the right data points naturally, such as capturing timestamps and outcomes during request processing. When definitions and data quality are strong, leaders can trust the metrics enough to act. Program monitoring should also connect to governance decision-making, because metrics become valuable only when they influence priorities, resourcing, and accountability. Leaders can act on metrics by assigning remediation ownership, funding improvements, changing policies, adjusting training, and prioritizing system redesigns that reduce privacy risk. The exam expects you to see that monitoring is not only for compliance teams, because monitoring results should be presented in a way leaders can understand, such as showing trends, highlighting risks, and explaining recommended actions. For example, if metrics show repeated delays in rights request fulfillment due to a specific system, a leader can prioritize investment in data mapping or system redesign to improve responsiveness. If metrics show vendor reviews are overdue, a leader can enforce procurement gates or allocate staff to catch up. If metrics show recurring privacy incidents caused by misdirected disclosures, a leader can fund training improvements and implement workflow controls to reduce errors. Monitoring also supports risk acceptance decisions, because metrics can show whether accepted residual risks remain stable or are worsening, prompting reevaluation. Another governance connection is transparency and accountability, because leaders need to know whether the program is meeting obligations and where failures occur. When monitoring is connected to action and accountability, it becomes a management system rather than a reporting exercise. Privacy program metrics must be chosen with care to avoid unintended harm or perverse incentives, because measurement can influence behavior in ways that conflict with privacy goals. If a program rewards low incident counts, teams may underreport incidents to look good, which increases risk. If a program rewards fast request handling without quality checks, teams may rush and make disclosure errors, creating new incidents. If a program rewards strict minimization without considering operational needs, teams may reduce data in ways that break fraud prevention or customer support, creating business pressure to bypass controls later. The exam may test whether you recognize that metrics should balance speed, quality, and fairness, and that metrics should be paired with controls that prevent gaming. For instance, measuring both time to fulfill rights requests and rate of corrections or complaints can provide a more balanced view. Measuring both vendor onboarding speed and completion of due diligence can prevent bypassing privacy review. Measuring both assessment completion and implementation of recommended controls can prevent assessments from becoming symbolic. Another key idea is that monitoring should be respectful of employees and avoid becoming punitive, because punitive measurement can reduce reporting and transparency. A mature program uses metrics to improve systems and training, not to blame individuals. When metrics are designed thoughtfully, they reinforce a healthy privacy culture and support continuous improvement. As we close, operationalizing program monitoring and metrics that leaders can act on means building a repeatable measurement and review system that turns privacy controls into observable, improvable performance. Monitoring verifies that policies, assessments, inventories, vendor controls, incident response processes, and rights workflows actually operate over time, while metrics summarize that verification into signals that guide decisions. Actionable metrics begin with leader questions, align to core operational capabilities, and focus on outcomes and leading indicators rather than vanity counts. Monitoring routines define who reviews what, how often, and how findings become remediation actions with follow-up verification, ensuring monitoring drives improvement instead of passive reporting. Clear definitions and strong evidence foundations make metrics trustworthy, while careful interpretation and balanced measures prevent gaming and reduce the risk of perverse incentives. Leaders can act on metrics by prioritizing investments, enforcing workflow gates, improving training, tightening vendor oversight, and reevaluating risk decisions based on trends. The CDPSE exam rewards this domain because privacy engineering depends on programs that stay effective through change, and monitoring and metrics are the tools that detect drift, prove performance, and drive continuous improvement. When you can explain how to design, govern, interpret, and act on privacy metrics, you demonstrate the program maturity that turns privacy obligations into sustainable operational reality.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.